Hello and welcome back to the Comic Literate podcast, the podcast that does deep dives into the best of comic books, graphic novels, mangas, and penny dreadfuls. I'm your host, the soon-to-be known as Comic Stan, and with me, as always, is my maniacal co-host, is Jamie.
It's fucking spooky season, man. I'm so excited.
It is the season of spooks and scares and screams, and it's not just because we're recording again.
No, and so we're doing a whole season of spooky stuff for spooky season. I'm genuinely excited.
One of the fascinating things I found when originally suggesting this, or us going over it, was the idea that I said, let's do all these spooky ones for October. And you're like, awesome. I was like, we might need to do 1 week when we do this other thing. And you were like, yeah, but artistically, we should stick to the idea of spooky season. Now, in my head, I didn't match it as much as like an artistic endeavor and more like when a supermarket just has spooky decorations for a month.
Well, no, this is art that we're creating here, Ryan. This is very important. It's part of the oeuvre.
In the sense that everything's art. But, you know, like under that, like in the sense that like a beer advert is art.
Ryan,
like,
it's either this or I start smearing shit on the walls again. And I'm going to be honest with you, the people who live above me much prefer the sound of podcasting than the smell of feces.
Write in if you would prefer the sound of podcasting or the smell of feces, which, and not to be clear, not listening to your favorite podcast, but just people who are near you recording a podcast. Yeah, because that's a very different thing.
Infinitely worse.
Yeah. It's not like a live viewing to your favorite podcast, because for every, like, when someone says they're into podcasts, that's, for me, it's like, it's even more broad than being like, I'm into film or TV.
When you say I'm into podcasts, you mean I'm into some podcasts.
Yes, I have some podcasts that I listen to.
There is some podcasts that I listen to when I'm doing my laundry. Therefore, I'm into podcasts. No, you're not into podcasts.
Yeah, and it's even worse. I feel like we, as a society, we haven't quite got the definition, like, genres of podcasts down yet.
No.
Because we can clear them in, like, very obvious ways, like a banter podcast, kind of like this one, or your scripted podcast.
Wait. Did you just refer to this as a banter podcast?
I mean, I try and banter.
Get in the sea.
You banter as well.
Get in the sea.
You don't admit you banter, but you do banter.
Get in the sea.
I've seen you banter.
This is an informative podcast only.
We wouldn't have any shorts if it wasn't for the banter.
No, this is a running argument. I just think there should be a space for informative commentary. And Ryan's like, no, Jamie, you have to try and be entertaining. And I'm like, but I'm not entertaining. I'm an anodyne man who sits alone in his little flat with his cat reading books.
And bearing in mind, we have been in pubs many a time where you have been entertaining. So it's not, don't try and hide behind this like, I don't entertain.
That's a problem that I have, though. That's not something to be celebrated.
Your lofty ideals for this being an informative, intelligent podcast, I figure, are well above your standing. Our standing, to be fair, our shared standing.
Yeah, they get scuppered every week.
The magic is, and if we have any new listeners, the magic really is that we combine the banterness of...
We've had a good time tonight, but let's not forget we've learnt some really important things.
We've also deconstructed this title, this comic book, and we've gotten to the real question of why are Blue Beetle's enemies all the same as him but different colours? What is the driving creative force behind that?
Jesus, man. I have but one life, and this is how I choose to spend at least an hour and a half of it every week.
I mean, but also shitting on superhero comics is its own reward, isn't it, sometimes?
I mean, dunking on Spider-Man, considering that I would never be able to dunk in a 1v1 with Spider-Man, is quite fun.
And that might be a little hint towards a future episode in a couple of weeks.
Spooky only. Only spooky, no superhero.
It's going to be a spooky one. It's going to be a bit of both. It's going to be a very special episode. But,
so what are we talking about today, Ryan?
Well, some people might have noticed that my description of you this week was maniacal, and they've probably seen the episode title, so it relates to that, because we are doing the Maniac of New York.
Oh, well done. I just glossed over maniacal because I was like, that's not very nice.
I mean, maniacal, like, is it, what, manic? I didn't look up the meaning.
It's inherently negative.
Evil, would you say? Is it evil?
Well, maniacal.
Yeah.
Like, you're a maniac.
I don't know if it's close to, like, manic. Like, is maniac and manic, are they related? Like, you can't be, like, a quiet maniac. Like, maniac involves a bit of loud noise.
But manic is inherently negative as well. I've never heard anybody be called manic in anything other than the pejorative sense.
Yeah, I suppose so. But it's not full on like evil, like nefarious, you
Considering I'm such a calm and level-headed human who makes such wonderful decisions.
I think we've established these descriptions are not all accurate. And if anything, they spur a debate at the beginning of every episode of whether you are or are not, or whether you agree to be the said word or not.
Well, today I'm going to be fucking maniacal just to spite you.
Fantastic. It fits in with the theme of the episode, because we are covering the Maniacal Maniac of New York, which is a interesting take on a horror trope for a spooky season of podcast episodes.
Yeah, it's like my first slasher comic.
It is, and they are few and far in between. It is a lesser known genre with the comics.
I suppose slasher films rely quite heavily on certain movie tropes and certain editing techniques and stuff like that. And so I imagine translating them to the page is actually quite the challenge.
Yeah, to get across the fear or terror that this genre tends to at least attempt to evoke.
Yeah.
And I would say, starting off right off the bat, I'd say this does a pretty good job of that.
Well, did you find it scary?
I found it did a good job of creating tension. So it did a good job of making you care about characters and then making you fear for their fate.
And then giving them a thorough slashing.
That's part of the slashers. That's
because I didn't find it scary at all.
You weren't like putting it away like, ah.
Well, and this is the thing, isn't it? I've often wondered about this in terms of like horror fiction as well. Is that I feel like horror really became a genre with film.
Well, I mean, people were somewhat scared of. So this is actually a bit of a good conversation to start off with before we propaganda the title.
I think so.
I've always wondered, could I be scared by text, by written text, by book?
And then I read a collection of Donald Trump's tweets and I realised that in fact was possible.
Yeah, but that's scary in a wider context kind of thing, isn't it?
That's existential dread.
Yeah. It's kind of scary, like one of the most scariest bits of television or film, depending on how you class it, was a old BBC...
the news?
Yes, that kind of related. There was a thing in the 80s called Threads. Have you heard of that?
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
So obviously the fear with that, and also related somewhat to the modern day Chernobyl series, it was the fear of like, this actually happened, or this could happen. Like, this is how close it is.
Chernobyl was incredibly well made and very tense.
Exactly. And
I'll never forget, I watched Chernobyl in an empty library that I managed. At the start of the pandemic, the library was shut, but I still needed to be there to like oversee it shutting down at the start of the pandemic, blah, 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 blah. And so I had nothing to do, and I'd read so much. And so I was like, I just need some TV. And so I went into the DVD section, because we still had a DVD section for some reason, and found a copy of Chernobyl and was just sat watching it as this apocalypse unfolded around me. And it was a very surreal experience.
It's kind of like at the beginning of the pandemic, you could see common searches on streaming sites and stuff, and pandemic and viruses became like really sharp. People were like, well, while we're in it, we might as well watch the very few pandemic films that there are. Also Cabin Fever.
Yes.
But so back to your original point, have you ever been scared by a book or writing at all?
Well, and reading this really made me think about that. I don't think I have, and that's not to say I've not read any horrors. I think the closest I maybe came was Carrie, which is a Stephen King novel, and it's kind of an existential thriller where Carrie becomes obsessed with the protagonist, and she's terrifying.
Isn't Carrie the protagonist?
Yeah, sorry, somebody gets obsessed. No, I think Carrie's the person who gets obsessed. I think that's the point.
I thought Carrie was about Carrie. She's the girl with the psychic powers. Not to spoil a text from however many decades
ago. It's the 1980s.
Yeah.
Well, this is the thing. It's a long time ago that I read it, but I remember Carrie making me feel some things.
Right.
And then there was this really creepy book by Haruki Murakami about a kid who gets trapped in a library and has to go through a set of trials to get out. And there were points where I was reading that really late at night, kind of with a desk lamp on my own, and had to put that down.
Right.
So yeah, there have been times that a book has scared me, but not like a straight slasher fic. It's always something a bit more existential.
Yeah, slasher works in this very kind of niche, pulpy kind of...
Well, it's jump scare stuff, isn't it?
It can be, but like I've watched... I'm
You're a fan of slasher films,
I'm a big
aren't you?
fan of horror, specifically in film and television. I've always been fascinated by could a book be scary, and I do at some point need to like pick up whatever the consensus for the scariest book is. I need to like sit down and read it and have a good try. I love Stephen King. People recommend Pet Sematary is a big one for that.
Yeah, Pet Sematary is a relatively recent one, I think, as well.
Well, a recent book because there was a film came out in like the 90s.
Well, there was a film that came out in the last few years.
Yeah, a remake, yeah.
Oh, so it was from the 90s, so it's not a relatively recent one.
Yeah.
I thought it was a more recent one.
The film, the latest film was in this age of remakes and, second tries and all that.
Stephen King's a really interesting one because he was infinitely popular in the 90s and he publishes just at an astonishing rate. But he's one of those whose popularity has kind of waned in the past sort of 10, 15 years. Like, you don't see as many people reading Stephen King anymore.
I think he became more known for his adaptations of his work.
Well, because there was so much of it.
Yeah. And I think he's still known, like, he's still a name. Like, people think of authors like Stephen King. Like,
yeah, but he's more one that, I think if you're buying a Stephen King novel, you're probably buying it for your dad on Father's Day. Yeah. As opposed to like, oh my God, I need to read the new Stephen King.
But again, that's where I've been drawn. It's like, maybe I should try one of these. But then that would break my cardinal rule of
never reading a book.
Books. Yeah, so I don't know. I'll have to experiment one day with a book, potentially. But I do like my horror TV and film. And so this was kind of that wheelhouse. And there are some slashes that work more on like longer tension and built rather than jump scares. Because jump scares are relatively widely considered to be cheap. Like, they can be done well, but they are the cheapest form.
I've not seen the big one.
What's the big one?
The really famous slasher with the scene in the shower with the...
Oh, Psycho.
Yeah, I've not seen Psycho.
Okay. It's a good one. It's interesting because, like, you get to a point with some older stuff where it's like, it's influenced so much that came after it that you don't...
comes off as a bit cheesy.
Exactly. But you then have to kind of try and have that objective look of like, this started all that genre and all those tropes. So it's good.
It's the way, as a guitar collector, I feel about the Fender Stratocaster.
Exactly.
Which is that it's really boring to look at, but then you remember it's only boring because everyone has ripped it off forever.
It's like how everyone looks at the wheel. They're like, I mean, that was a good invention at the time, but we're kind of past that now, you know?
But Ryan, are there more wheels or doors?
Wheel? Do you mean windows?
Oh, no, I fucked it up.
That. To be fair, that could be another one.
Wheels or doors? I think I've seen wheels or doors.
Yeah. Write in if you think there's more wheels or doors in the universe. And
comicliterate@gmail.com.
And just remember, 18-wheelers exist, so that can skew your ideas potentially.
But no, so in terms of like... But, see, I was thinking about this a lot as I was reading it. And my big question for myself and for you, and it's a non-rhetorical question, so if you do want to write in, it's comicliterate@gmail.com. Is this actually a horror or is it an existential thriller?
I think it's both. I defined it personally more as the horror genre being used as a satirical piece.
It didn't strike me as horror because there was this sad inevitability to Harry's killings that made it really sad reading, and it made it a bit of a slog for me, like, oh my God, this is just so miserable. Because, everybody in this giant city is just beholden to him and it's become normal and it's sort of commonplace that he murders people. I know this is probably something you were going to get into later.
Well, I feel like you're not confusing, but I think you are more experiencing the negativity from the real life satirical part of it.
Yeah, whereas for me, it fell down as a horror because I wasn't scared of Harry because I was just waiting for the next time I saw him.
Yeah.
Whereas, what I think one of the things that for me makes a really successful horror is when you don't get as much of a look at what you're supposed to be scared of. So a really great example of that, and probably the most terrifying piece of media I've ever consumed, was Silent Hill 2.
Yeah.
Because the thing you were scared of was fucking nebulous. It had no form. You didn't know what you were looking for. You just know that when it went near people, they died. And I remember having to turn that game off a lot as a kid.
Yeah.
Because I was terrified of it. Whereas here, we know what Harry looks like. We know his modus operandi. We know when Harry's going to appear, and he does. And so I don't, and I'm not saying this is like a negative. I'm just saying I'm not 100% sure that they were trying to write a horror.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. It was literally what I was going to say anyway, was I don't consider this a true horror. I consider it a satirical comic that uses the horror genre as a vehicle.
Well, it uses the slasher fic specifically.
Yeah.
Like it uses the slasher flick as a vehicle to actually say something. And I'm not 100% sure I know what it's trying to say to me.
I think it says it's attempting to say quite a bit. And we'll break that down. We're only looking at the first volume, the first 5 issues.
Yeah.
It's an interesting release with this kind of one because normally, as we know, even limited release seasons, comics series, they have volumes, but they just keep going. Like volume 1 ends, volume 2 starts next month. Like it keeps going. This one is very much like they would release a volume and then a month or a year goes by, and then the second volume comes out.
So like seasons of TV.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So it's a little bit different for a lot of comics. You can tell a lot of the difference because there's a subtitle to each volume. So first one's Maniac of New York, and I think the subplot unofficially is Death Train, which obviously, is relevant.
That's fucking telling, isn't it?
The next one is Bronx on Fire or something like that. Let me just double check that. And then the third one is Don't Call It a Comeback, which is like
Don't call it a comeback. So are these subtitles all based on the titles of the books that the author in situ inevitably writes about all of Harry's little killing sprees?
I think they're somewhat related. The third one is just about him. Well, it's about a comeback of such, without to spoil too much. Yeah, but yeah, they're kind of tangentially related.
Well, given what I know about Harry and the subtitle of the second one being Bronx on Fire, I imagine they work out how they think they've stopped him, right? By burning the Bronx down.
Well, as I said, we'll get into it in this one. Just burn the entire borough down.
Can we, when you actually get to the point where you tell me, can you splice my prediction back in to see how close I got?
I mean, I can tell you afterwards how close you are. I have read the second volume,
I know,
but we're only covering the first today because I think the first one, it encapsulates everything you need to know.
I mean, let's be honest here. The first volume was all I had time to read.
Yeah, that's fair. But I think it's quite a rich first volume. There's lots to talk about. I think so. It's hard to know where to start with this one, so I'm going to start with. How about we start and you tell us what the general story of the first volume is?
Okay.
So I'm a person. I picked up Maniac of New York. And I'm like, what's this about?
A government official has been drafted into work in the Maniac.
Was she drafted or did she volunteer?
She volunteered
right.
to work. Right, you don't get to cut in, yeah? You're making me do this. At least let me get on with it.
It's like a teacher live marking.
Dickhead. She volunteers to head up the Maniac Task Force and finds herself battling between the general sort of, Jesus Christ, brain fart. I'm feeling deeply inarticulate today.
Do you want to start again? Or
No, we can just let it roll.
Fair enough.
She finds herself caught between public opinion and the general lack of concern by higher command. She finds herself working with an unlikely partner in a cop who has been segregated away from the rest of the force on account of being a snitch. And she finds herself on a one-woman crusade to try and get rid of the Maniac.
Okay. I'd almost say that was good, but I still don't really know, as a person who's just picked up, who's the Maniac? Or what is the Maniac aspect?
The Maniac is a masked mass murderer. Think Scream, but in a hockey mask. Also, something that bothers me is they say he has an axe, but he does not have an axe.
Yeah, that is weird. I don't know why. I don't know why they put it like that. Maybe it was an artistic change after the dialogue was already written or something, but...
Also, there's a quiet implication that he's super.
Yes.
He's enhanced, isn't he?
Well, he's not human, put it that way.
Because he doesn't articulate himself like a human. And then they have... Because my first thinking, right, was that you couldn't have a mass murderer who stabbed people in the street in America because he'd just be riddled with bullets the first time he tried it.
Yeah, 100%.
Because, there's just so many... I mean, you've been to New York. I've been to New York. There's 4 cops on every street corner, all of them with a pistol.
Yeah.
He would just be full of bullets, but of course he's enhanced and he's super.
Well, when you said what he's like, or comparing him to, would you say the Scream guy?
Scream, yeah.
I think most people would go more Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th because of the hockey mask.
Yeah.
And he specifically, the point that it goes from slasher to horror, I think there's a very thin, almost non-existent line where the difference is slasher is a person killing other people, and then horror becomes the slasher is inhuman and cannot be killed by conventional means.
Yeah.
And that's what you've got here. And you're exactly right. If a person tried to attempt this, they'd be shot after like 3 killings, especially because he first strikes in Times Square on New Year's Eve, which the whole point is like it's meant to be the most populated area you could possibly do something like that. But I mean,
if you were going to go apeshit with an axe and that you were like a murderous nutter, it would be one of the places that you'd earmark for, isn't it?
Yeah, and especially if you were concerned about surviving afterwards.
Or if survival wasn't a concern for you because you knew you couldn't be killed by conventional means.
Yeah. I'll just say before we get into as well, the writer, Elliott Kalan, Kalan, from The Daily Show, as well as Spider-Man and X-Men, naturally. But The Daily Show is like the interesting credit there, I think, but that relates to like the political satire.
I'm super not familiar with The Daily Show.
It's just like, it's something that really only exists in America, it seems like. It's a satirical interview style show. So The Daily Show specifically is more news-ish, like talking about the news, as opposed to your typical late night shows, which is like celebrity interview. Yeah. So Daily Show's a lot more political. Jon Stewart's probably the most famous guy from there.
Jon Stewart.
He's, again, more American, he is American, but he's not as well known in the UK. But it's because he's so ingrained into American politics. That's probably why. So
we've had this conversation that I just don't follow the news, haven't we?
Yeah, exactly.
I have more important things to worry about.
But I think objectively it's interesting that, as I said, a political comedy writer writing a comic, and it kind of shows. And the artist, Andrea Mutti, who...
Why is that a name I recognise?
Well, she's done other comics, as far as we know. He or she, I'm never sure, Andrea.
Well, it depends on where they're from, doesn't it?
Yeah. But they, straight off the bat, and always a good place for us always to start off with is the art. I think the art really suits the storytelling here.
Yeah,
because
it's great.
Especially, it's that kind of watercolor-esque style.
Yeah.
Which just gives its own kind of vibe, but also very importantly, it uses the very muted colors throughout the entire thing, which just gives it that kind of sense of gloom and dread all the way through.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it does the same thing very effectively that House on the Lake does. It really put me in mind of the art there. Kind of reminded me of some of the art in Human Target.
Yeah, definitely.
Again, it's that softer, more sepia toned thing.
But I think these were even bleaker colours then.
Definitely more muted. Yeah. Like a really, really muted colour palette.
A lot of beige and greys and
the thing
urban colours.
The thing that it didn't have that often this type of art I've noticed has is a sketchiness to the lines. Like the line work is really crisp here.
So I felt the line work I think was a bit faint. And that...
Well, it was faint, but it was crisp.
Yes, and the faintness kind of made me feel, it almost gave it like a bit of a dreamlike feeling. And then
it made it feel softer.
Yeah, and then when the horror starts, for lack of a better term, then it drifts from like dream to nightmare. Like it felt that way. And especially with the background color changes, like when the horror really ramps up, the entire background is like maroon or red or orange, and it always like shifts the emotion with the art.
And I think it's interesting that you say dream and nightmare because cinema has really trained us to associate anything in muted or softer tones as being a dream or a flashback.
Yep.
And so, the whole thing does have this kind of automatic association, doesn't it? With something a little bit dreamlike. I found the art really enjoyable. I mean, again, because it was so muted and drab, I don't know that I found it enjoyable in the way that I sometimes do with a comic where there was no big full page spreads.
There was a couple of large panels. They weren't quite full page.
There were a couple of larger panels, but there weren't any, the big full page spreads that the big two will use to really punch stuff in. Brian K. Vaughan's work is really, really, I always think of him when I think of that.
And 8 Billion Genies did some great double page spreads.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas there was none of that here. So there was none of those big full page panels played off for impact. And so I actually just didn't remember coming away from it at the end and being like, oh, the art was cool, but I didn't really notice it.
Yeah.
But it was, to steal a term that we use when we make music, it was serving the song, right? It was really serving the comic.
Yeah.
It gave me a feel for what I was reading.
So with the colours as well, it made the red pop out in very contrastly.
This is what I was about to say.
Even though the red colour itself is still itself quite muted. So it's not like bright or contrasting, but compared to the grey and beige and everything you're used to. The red really contrasts against that.
Red was also the only big primary colour they used.
Yes, yeah.
So everything else was very muted. So even though it wasn't the most like pure toned, it wasn't like the most cool toned red you've ever seen. It was quite a warm toned red that they used for the blood. But it was the only time you saw large swathes of a primary colour. And so it really did punch through. And then counterbalanced over the fact that when they show you dead bodies, and they show you a lot of dead bodies, they tend to show you them in soft focus, and it really draws attention to the fact that there is blood, they are dead.
This is very much, I think the art is very much like the bass and drums of a song that you don't quite notice until they're removed. And then you go, oh, this song's shit without them. But they, as you say, they serve the purpose.
Yeah, they're serving the song. But no, again, I mean, I think one of the things that I really want to do with the podcast is kind of lean more into talking about the art, because it's, for me, often the most interesting thing that's happening on the page, because it's most of what's happening on the page.
Yeah, and it's like half the medium if you're writing and art.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the panel layout wasn't saying much to me. Like there was some nice moments where they had a top third, a bottom third, and then the middle third broken up into a few panels, and that scanned quite nicely. I mean, it all scanned well. This is the thing. Like I never found myself having to look back at a page to work out what was going on. I followed every conversation. Like, it was well laid out, wasn't it?
Yeah. I feel like the panel layout I could better describe as intentionally basic.
Yeah.
I think it wasn't trying to draw attention away from the story, but because we've read some comics where one page will be great story, and another page the story kind of takes a backseat, and then you've got this like intricate panel layout like, whoa, we're going over here, and this is crazy. Whoa, they've combined the foreground and the background. This was very much here's the next panel, here's the next part of the story.
Yeah, 100%.
And I appreciate that. Again, I think this was very much intentionally let the story take the driving, take the driver's seat, and this kind of mellowed in the background.
And the story, so I think there's a distinction that we haven't really drawn that much on the podcast, which is the distinction between plot and story. I feel like this had a lot of plot, but for me, the story was a bit meh.
It depends what you mean by story as opposed to plot, because I guess like to define them for going forward. So the plot I always think of as I hope you'd agree is then this happens, then this happens, this happens. Story is like what is the character motivation, the arcs, the things like that. And I think with this, because again, touching on the whole satirical aspect of it, I think the plot is in service of the satire and not the story.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I suppose.
Because it takes a lot of time to show this wider stuff. Like, there's a lot of panels that are exclusively dedicated to being like, this is kind of like this real world thing. Like,
yes.
I've made a lot of notes of just lines that encompass that entirely. And the first one off the bat is the news story talking about the first attack.
Yeah.
And they go, all of us must live as if this could happen to us at any of us, anywhere, at any time.
Yeah.
So immediately feeds into that fear of domestic terror kind of thing. And
given that this was set in New York, that's absolutely the vibe I got.
Exactly.
Is that this is this could only be a post 9/11 story, right?
Yeah. And my point is, it's dedicating panels to those kind of satirical points, rather than the story.
I mean, the heaviest moment of satire for me is right at the end, when the mayor is rallying the troops after that big attack on the death train, and he says, "We will have a fully automated train."
Yeah.
And his primary concern is his pet project, which is automating the New York City Metro. For no good reason. Like, nobody wants it other than him, and he's just forcing this stuff through.
See, for me, it was the panels just before the time jump. So we start off 2016, initial attack, and then it jumps to 2020.
Yeah.
And just before that time jump, you have the New York mayor, as well as the senator and the entire US Senate, all condemning it and making their big speeches and saying we will not allow this to happen again in a roundabout way. And then cut to 4 years later, and here to the local Harry prediction, weather report, essentially.
Well, and they roll it in with the weather report. So
exactly.
It's weather Metro News, and
Harry attacks, yeah.
Yeah, like they are just the three. I mean, that was galling, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Because it really speaks to the human capacity to live with any discomfort, providing it's there for that long enough.
Yeah. You just get used to things on a long enough scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's why this can be a metaphor for so many different things.
Oh, 100%. It's very metaphorically resonant.
But my point was, with regards to the story, is it's dedicating panels to those parts that have really nothing to do with the main story, but they are taking a lot bigger focus on the wider implication and the satire.
Which is what...
I feel like I should put a penny in the jar every time I say satire, because it's going to be a lot in this episode.
Which is what moves it away from being a horror and kind of edges it towards something a bit more existential.
Exactly.
Because we get those snippets of the wider world, and we're really looking at this through the lens of the wider world.
To give you an idea of how spot on the satire is, one of the senators...
I'm not 100% sure that it is satire.
I think, well, at this point, my arguer, one of the senator, the New York senator, who they basically are saying, like, and then he condemned the attacks and made sure they never happened again. They literally name him Senator McCafferty, and they are not the New York senator, but a senator. And they say something about, he talks about like, oh, no, that's it. So there's, in their later attacks, they're like, oh, it's 2020 and Harry's killed 4 people randomly. And because there are 4 women out late at night, it's the Kentuckian senator who's like, Senator McCafferty, who's like, maybe they shouldn't have been out by themselves at that time.
Yeah, so, he questions them, doesn't he?
Exactly. And they say like, oh, that Kentucky charm didn't go very far in that quote. That is literally Senator McConnell, the real life Kentucky senator. Yeah. So that's how close this satire is.
Yeah, that's how nailed on they got it.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And again, that's a very real argument that is used by people to victim blame people who've been sexually assaulted. Like, that is just a thing that fucking happens.
Yeah, and this is what I mean by, I think the satire is not quite focused enough to be one particular message.
No, you're right. I mean, it is just a scathing indictment in the way that America's governed, isn't it?
Yeah, and to an extent, modern society, because if you're a Western society, you are somewhat modeled after America. Like, that is just undeniable truth.
God, I don't like to think of it that way, but maybe.
That's part of that existential horror. That's that meme, the astronauts. It's like, wait a minute, it's all America? Always has been.
The United States of England.
I tell you one thing I do like, moving away from the whole satire thing, I think this used tropes really well. So we've said before about some titles where they come across maybe a bit, I don't want to go so far as say hacky, but like very, very trope ridden.
A bit tropey.
Yeah.
A bit tropic.
But I feel like this one used them in a good way.
Which ones?
So
out of interest.
Obviously there's the horror ones, like those are pretty bold. But like you kind of made a point earlier, it's also got that odd couple detective.
Yeah, I suppose.
Even though one of them's technically a politician and is in charge of like a task force.
She's more like a civil servant, isn't she?
But also she's like gets guns, like, let's go shoot the Harry.
Yeah.
But so they do very near the start, they do the odd couple trope of seeing them both getting ready in the morning and showing how different they are. So one, the character Green is riding her exercise bike first thing, and then she's like ready for work. The other one's like waking up late and drinking and
smoking a cigarette.
Exactly. So it uses that trope. And we've said before, like, if you use a trope to cover some ground quicker to then get to what you really want to do, I think that's a good use of the trope.
Well, that's what they're for at their core, isn't it?
Yeah. And, well, I think sometimes people use them as just laziness. We've seen some, like, lazy stuff. It's like, they're just doing the same stuff over and over again.
Yeah.
That's been done 100 times before and they're not doing anything new.
Yeah.
Texts like these, I'm a bit more give a benefit of the doubt. I'm like, they are trying to get to something else quicker. So they use tropes to be like, here's a odd couple, they're being partnered and it's like Lethal Weapon. Now let's get to what we really need to get to. So I credit it with using tropes well. That might be a bit more of a subjective opinion, but I don't know if you agree.
No, I can see it, yeah. I mean, and it is quite tropey, isn't it? It's quite tropey, it's quite pulpy. I'm trying to think if there's anything else at play here. I mean, there's definitely the sort of the trope of the cop fallen from grace.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that the thing that she has done to get herself so openly reviled by her colleagues is snitch.
And again, that ties into the satire again of modern policing.
So, for reference, her former partner shot somebody and she gave testimony that ended up in him going to prison, and so the rest of the police force no longer trust her and have stuck her on Harry duty. Which again, like, Harry is from what we can see, the biggest existential threat to the people of New York at the moment is Harry, and the person they've put on the job is somebody that none of them want to work with. And I think it really speaks to the apathy that we're capable of as a species. So when Green gets given her office, it's a single office, and the task force has gradually over those 4 years been reduced to one person. And it's like the apathy that human beings can sometimes adopt when they're dealing with an ongoing situation, as opposed to mounting a response to something new. So when this was new and it first started happening, they built a task force and they gave like nice offices and they did all this stuff and they put a load of funding towards it. And then 4 years later, it's just one lonely civil servant who normally they have to like rope into it, who's just stuck fighting this immovable object or this unstoppable force.
Yeah, I think it's the helplessness that leads to the apathy. It becomes like, and another thing this kind of relates to in a further way is like global warming and, you know, climate change, because it's just a thing that's happening and it sucks, but a lot of people feel like, well, it's, you know, we've tried and we can't really do much and now we're just leaving it. And now you get to a point where people are looking at the benefits of it, for the prime example being that the detective, whose name I will bring up, Pettibone, yeah. She's at a crime scene and they're like, oh, look, another Harry killing, one to add to the books. And she's like, well, Harry doesn't really use a gun at point blank, so I don't think it was him. And they're like, oh, come on, just take off our hands.
Yeah,
so already
100%.
You've got police being like, let's just chuck it in the Harry pile because it's there and we can use it. And that's
so,
not going to change.
It's given the New York police a reason not to investigate homies anymore.
And it was a great little economic use of storytelling because they show that and they show her relationship to the rest of the police as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's quite economic storytelling. They fit a lot in, and again, using the tropes to get a lot in such a small time.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't dislike it. It did leave me, I'll be honest, it left me feeling a bit flat.
That's fair. I mean, I enjoyed the uses of the different genres, and again, I'm a horror fan, so I just like a fresh kind of take on this horror thing. And its use, like, I just enjoyed it for that especially as well.
Yeah, no, and I get that. I mean, I'm trying to investigate why I think it left me feeling a little bit flat. Do you know what I mean?
It might be because this doesn't, even though it's a volume in itself, it's not an ending. It's just, it felt like a first volume.
That's an interesting point. I mean, because the actual, like, it does come to a point of climax, doesn't it? Like, she burns him. We think he's gone. We see him kill again. We see him kill that homeless guy.
Yeah.
Like it does have this kind of point of climax where we're like, no, something big has happened. Something notable has happened. A big Harry event has happened. Like it feels like he kills in dribs and drabs, and then there's these big mass killings that he does. And so we see one of those, but it just left me feeling flat. I don't know if it has to do with the general kind of writing. Because it was perfectly well written. It was fine. I don't know that I particularly enjoyed any of the character interactions.
I like the relationship between Green and Pettibone. Like I
don't even really feel like I had a sense of it.
I feel like there was a lot of little, the dreaded word, banter between them. But it was that kind of like them ribbing each other and that kind of building a sense of camaraderie, and them also going through this traumatic thing together as well. Like there's little parts that made it a bit more interesting for me. Like for example, so they're on the train, they managed to get on the train, they're trying to save whoever might still be alive, because again, one of the good horror aspects is the setting is essentially it's people on a train, stuck on a train with a unstoppable killer.
Yeah.
Like, so that, and I think the comic did a good job of creating that sense of horror through that one character.
And to be clear, they are stuck on the train because the mayor has made a decision that they're going to seal the doors and keep the train running and not let them off.
Yeah, specifically, let's trap the serial killer regardless of who he kills on the train.
Yeah, which is, you know, I mean, it feeds into that kind of malaise that I felt reading it, where I was like, this is just really sad. But again, even that whole passage, because that ran over 2 issues, didn't it? That ran over issues 3 and 4.
Yeah, and what was good with one of the issue, where as soon as it starts with a like big spread of all the victims, and it gives you their names and what they were doing.
I liked that. I did like that, and again, I liked some of the little storytelling things it did. But we were talking about the relationship with Green and Pettibone, and I just don't really feel like there was anything that interesting there. There was no, I never really got a sense of them as people. And that was kind of the core relationship that this whole text was based around, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That was like the main human relationship. And, we see a little bit of Green's motivation in her ex-boyfriend, who was like a very early, almost unrecorded victim.
Yeah.
And we see Pettibone's backstory. And again, they're both like very tropey. Like dead ex-boyfriend, downtrodden cop who's gotten in trouble for doing the right thing, like not liked on the force. And they're very tropey backstories, and they were handled relatively well. I just didn't really get a sense of that relationship, and I think it kind of spoiled me enjoying it as much, I
think it was little bits for me that made me like a bit more, like I said, when they're on the train and they're both like going down the carriages with the guns and there's bodies everywhere, and Green is somehow Pettibone's just like, here, have a drink of this flask, it'll help.
Yeah.
And then as soon as they then first interact with Harry, Green tries to shoot her and almost hits one of the survivors.
Yeah.
So immediately Pettibone's like, fuck's sake, shouldn't have given you that flask, kind of thing. And I felt like that was a little bit of like that level of thinking wouldn't normally happen in this kind of
But Green
text.
didn't even drink from the flask, and Pettibone saw that she didn't.
I thought she did, and the whole point was that she
says she gave it to her, and she said, "Oh, years ago I would have drained this, but this is for afterwards."
Yeah, you're right.
And then she spits it at the maniac, doesn't she? Because she knows he's afraid of fire, because that's the whole thing that's come out.
Yeah, I misinterpreted that then.
Well, no, because Pettibone does say that, and that's the point. It's almost like the writer forgot halfway through that he'd had Green not drink from the flask, or he just kind of wanted Pettibone to say that, but they also wanted Green to not drink from the flask, and they had their cake and ate it, kind of thing. Like, again, it just... The whole thing with their relationship was supposed to be like the central human element that we were meant to buy into, and I just didn't really buy it. And that's not to say the comic book was bad. It just didn't land for me. I didn't particularly like either of their dialogue.
I thought the dialogue was okay in the sense that it fit the trope and the 100%.
Genres. It fitted the genre.
Yeah,
but that's kind of to say it wasn't very good.
Like fair.
Bad dialogue is a trope of horror fiction, isn't it?
I wouldn't go so far as to say bad, but I know what you mean, that it wasn't as interesting. Like, good dialogue obviously makes you interested, invested in the characters.
Yeah.
It didn't quite draw me out. Like, I class bad dialogue as something that takes me out of the text.
Yeah, 100%.
And at least for this, it didn't take me out, but it was because it was fulfilling, again, the expected tropes of the genres.
And again, my whole thing here is that the cut and thrust of my argument isn't that it's bad, it's that it left me feeling flat.
Yeah, that's
and I
fair.
think we've identified that is that the dialogue was perfectly serviceable. It just wasn't interesting.
Yeah, I think what I was getting out of this whole thing is I was appreciating and enjoying the mix of the genres with the satire.
Yeah, 100%.
And I think you were looking at it from a more conventional, like, what is this story trying to, get me to feel kind of thing.
Yeah, 100. I mean, maybe, yeah. I mean, it's about...
That is kind of a trope of horror as well. Like, there are horrors that are elevated because they're considered well written and have, very four-dimensional characters that are very empathetic. But a lot of horror, and this kind of the slasher horror, going back to the beginning, is one kind of good example of this is the flashback to the first killings is very much a on-the-nose nod to Friday the 13th. They were camp counselors at a campground. So that's Friday the 13th, like the first four before they start getting weird with the franchise.
I mean, that's classic slasher stuff, isn't it?
Started by those
You're
films.
in a remote place, cabin in the woods. That's very much on the nose for that genre, isn't it?
But what the thing about those films is those characters are not empathetic. Like, the whole point of it, like the trope of horror is that they are teens who are having sex and doing drugs and all this, and they're almost punished by this force. But then it always leads to like the final girl, which is normally a girl, sometimes it's a guy, but it's the final character who's normally a bit more virtuous, and you feel for one character like, I hope they survive, and then it becomes 50-50 and that's where the tension ramps up. So it uses these more disposable characters, the bad ones, quote unquote, be like, look, he's just bloody killing people, like, he's unstoppable. And then you have the one empathetic character, or one or two, depending on the horror, and then those are the ones you're like rooting to survive.
I absolutely forgot to view those old horrors, through the lens of like 1980s American morality. Because again, their sense of morality is vastly different to mine.
Yeah.
The popular and general sense of morality in America in the 1980s is very different to my experience of things. And that does make a certain level of sense now that I think back to those old slasher films. It's always a bunch of teenagers having a good time. Whereas when I saw them as a teenager, doing all the things that I was doing as a teenager, I was like, why are you killing these, perfectly...
They seem nice.
Yeah,
they're just having sex and doing drugs. Like, that's what I do.
That's a perfectly acceptable way to spend a Friday night. Like, why are you doing this?
I think one point that you made to me, which was kind of the reverse of what's just happened, is you highlighted that for me for superheroes, where you said, oh yeah, because superheroes are reflective of the time.
Yeah.
Horror is exactly that as well.
Yeah, nothing exists in a vacuum. Everything exists in context.
And during that time, those original slashers came up during that more Puritan, the religious right of the 80s.
Yeah.
And it was appealing to that kind of feeling.
D&D and metal music was akin to devil worship and stuff.
Exactly.
A weird fucking place, man.
But then you look at where we're at now, and I know this is a weird one to use an example, but like Stranger Things, those characters play D&D and they are empathetic for it because they're the nerds who are isolated from everyone else and playing Dungeons and Dragons. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those tropes for me, I think that was what I was getting more than the specific character.
And that makes sense. And I suppose maybe I'm missing the point with it, but it's one of the aspects of it that just left me feeling a bit flat. The thing that really didn't leave me feeling flat was the mayor and everything he got up to. Like, the idea of that level of, lack of consideration for his populace from a politician, it just rang so true to me.
And one could say that the mayor was the real monster of the book.
Well, yeah, I mean...
kind of a Frankenstein's monster kind of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on whether you're reading the 1837 or the 1817 folio, if I'm being completely honest with you, but that's fine.
Obviously, the readers know what you're on about, obviously.
Yeah. Well, if they've done English degrees, they probably do.
So the one person who saw the literature part of the name of the podcast went, "Ooh, literature," and they went, "This isn't really literature, though, is it?"
This is just a guy with an English degree swearing.
There's one guy talking about literature, but the other one keeps talking about cosmic treadmills and pennies in bat caves.
If you don't know about the cosmic treadmill, go to the Flash episode. It's a great time.
Or the shorts.
It
gets mentioned quite a bit in those as well.
Yeah, go to the shorts. Look at one that has Flash or anti-Flash on it.
Reverse Flash.
Reverse Flash, for fuck's sake. And I suppose you're right. I don't so the stuff with the mayor I found really interesting. Like, his whole presence I found really interesting. And I think the thing that I found so interesting in it is that general sense that Harry becomes an inevitability. And, you were talking about everything they were doing in the story to set the world up.
Yeah.
And I think the world creation, the world building here was really good. Like, I really enjoyed the world building.
Some could say the world building was the real horror because it's the rest of the world's apathy to what's happening
that's allowing it to continue to happen, right? Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think there's something to be said for world building that's done on such a short scale because, when we talk about really great pieces of world building, we talk about Pratchett and George R.R. Martin and obviously Tolkien, yeah. And Mervyn Peake, who wrote the Gormenghast series, or like Asimov in his sci-fi.
Stan Lee and Steve Ditko.
To a certain degree, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. But what we're talking about is world building that happens on a grander scale with thousands of pages to introduce lore and backstory and other characters that enrich in it. Whereas here we had 5 issues of a comic book and they built a really, really a really bleak, immersive alternate New York. And I think that is actually quite interesting. Objectively, that is interesting.
And that also comes back to what I was saying about using the tropes. It also uses real-world political tropes.
Yeah.
Like, prime example, one after the first killings in 2016, there's someone who's wearing a pin, and they're like, "Oh, it's to raise awareness for the victims of Times Square."
Ribbon,
and that's such like a thoughts and prayers and all that, like the absolute just not worth anything bollocks.
It's the black screen on Instagram. It's token.
It's hey, this bad shit's going on right now, but look at me, I'm also sad about it. Like, that is it. That's the point of that.
Token gestures in the face of real life suffering.
Yes.
That, oh God, it's just it's one of the symptoms of the disease as far as I'm concerned.
Someone who put it well for me, and I'm not fully on, like, there's a comedian in America called Anthony Jeselnik, and he's known, one, for being like a really dark comedian, but also what he'll do is he will tweet jokes about tragedies on the day of the tragedy.
Oh.
And his argument...
Does he do that?
Yeah, he does it. And no one, like, people, like, take offense, but he's like, this is literally, like, I'm a comedian. This is what I do. Like, and
I want to get in there first.
Yeah, and his ultimate argument is, he says, and again, I'm not saying this is okay. I'm not condoning what he does.
Yes.
But I'm saying the argument is worth looking into. And his argument is, he says, people are like, oh, what if, a victim of that tragedy sees your joke and sees you, talking about it? And he's like, if you've just been through a tragedy, are you checking Twitter the same day?
Well, that's an interesting point.
And he's like, victims have got victim shit to do on the day of. Like, they're not like the people. And he says, like, everyone else who's doing the thoughts and prayers, it's like, that's more of a hollow gesture than him actively making a joke about it.
Him actively engaging with the tragedy that's occurred. I mean,
and his telling jokes about it can only really exist in a world where we are quite apathetic to tragedies. Like, that's part of it as well.
And this is the thing, isn't it? Like, social media is, as far as I'm concerned, the lowest form of entertainment.
Yeah.
It holds you in a point of stasis. It's
little bits of endorphin, like a little hit of endorphin with every scroll and new post.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the idea that, I mean, I've long wondered why people take what happens on social media so seriously.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I mean, he's a fucking comedian. He has this instant medium where he can make his joke. Why not make your joke? And again, I suppose he's not asking anybody to laugh at it, and he's not asking for any friends from it. He's doing what he does. And I think, people put way too much weight on what happens on social media these days.
And interestingly, in the second volume, I'm surprised they don't do it in this first one, but in the second volume, the point of that is Harry, basically the attack happens at a school. And in it, you have one part where all these kids can see Harry trying to get to them through a door, and they're all filming him. And then Green and Pettibone realize where he is, where he's attacking, because of the social media posts.
Wow.
And again, it keeps referencing like how we react to tragedies in the modern day,
Well, it is. I mean, it's everybody's first instinct when they see either something interesting or terrible happen is to pull their phone out and start recording it.
Yeah. I think one area that's worth a lot of examination as well is there's quite a bit of one of the issues dedicated to the detective, Green and Pettibone, talking to the guy who wrote the book about it. And it takes a bit there, and there's a lot of like little bits there which I thought were quite interesting. The biggest one being the fact that there's a safe space within New York.
Yeah, right in the Upper East Side near Greenwich Village as well, like the posh bit of New York.
And I love little bits like this, and the very end, which we'll get to as well.
Yeah.
I love little bits like that because for the horror, I like lore horror. So like, it's, like antithetical to horror when you've got a horror creature or monster and then you see it and it makes it less scary because you can see it. I'm one of those people who I like, and then it's like, what's its name? Where is it from? What's its weakness? Like, I like all that kind of stuff.
Like, you like the top trumps element.
Yeah, and that's where it becomes like the genre
like
of
Pokemon cards.
Yeah, and that's where it becomes like the genre of the monsters and that kind of stuff. So that little bit of like, ooh, there's a safe space. I'm like, I like that because I want to know why. Like, I'm like, why is it? Like, what's the reveal gonna be as to why that is?
I mean, the obvious implication is that it's being controlled by a shady corporate elite.
No, it's kind of hinted at in. So I mean, like we've covered spoilers anyway. So if this is spoiler the first volume, but if you enjoy, like if you want to try this, like this is just one volume we're talking about. There's a second one already out, and a third is coming out right now. So you've got plenty more to get into if you want to keep listening. So it hints towards the end. One of the characters, no, not even one of the characters. It just cuts to some people in a museum, and so when they're on the train, more importantly, you've got one woman and two kids.
At the end of the first volume, right?
Yeah,
in the museum.
A bit before that, you've got the woman and two kids who are the last survivors of the train, and this is what I was going to mention before is this is why I think it was really good at ramping up the tension.
Yeah.
It uses the panels without dialogue to show they're trying to get away from Harry, and he's slowly approaching, and the inherent fear and terror of the good facial expressions of the characters. Get a really good sense of the terror.
I mean, the art's always the art's great throughout, isn't it?
And there's a little bit of Deus Ex Machina where he's about to reach them, and then you hear on the tannoy that they're getting to the museum.
Yeah.
And he stops, and then the girl says later that she saw fear in his eyes, and then he turns around and goes the other way.
Oh, and the museum's in the safe zone.
Museum's in the safe zone, and at the end,
yeah,
it cuts to some strangers looking at stuff in the museum.
Yes,
and they're talking about like, oh, these are from like Native Americans in this area, and they've stolen all the stuff and put it in this museum. And then they just don't see the connection at all, because then they're like, oh, did you hear Harry hit the train or whatever? There's an amulet in the museum that's the same markings as the hockey mask.
Oh, I didn't clock it. Yeah.
And so that, for me, I'm like, lore. Like, I love, let's go. There's something here. Let's find out what the backstory is.
I didn't clock it, mate. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
That is undeniably cool. I like that. It reminds me of the amulet of Helene in Why the Last Man.
Yeah. And hopefully we'll see if this pays off or not in a similar way or not.
I mean, I almost preferred that the amulet of Helene was a red herring.
Yeah, that was a good plot point.
It was great. It was a banging plot point. Because he was like dying of botulism, wasn't he? But no, that is cool.
And I appreciate like when I said that it was kind of a Deus Ex Machina. Like in the moment, it was.
Yeah.
But then it's informing later plot points.
And a Deus Ex Machina is only a Deus Ex Machina if it comes out of nowhere and completely saves the day.
Yeah.
Whereas this is an informed plot point, isn't it?
Yes.
And so 100% I can get behind that. And do you know what? I didn't clock it, mate. Didn't notice it. I mean, again, I was a little bit fatigued with it by the end of the 5th issue. Like I read it all in one go. I read it all in one sitting.
Whereas I was still like, oh my God, lore.
Yeah, and do you know what? That is exactly the kind of thing that I would have found interesting as well. And so maybe if I'd been paying a little bit, because my interest kind of dropped towards the end of the last issue. So maybe if I'd really been paying attention, I would have spotted it as well.
Yeah.
But that is cool. And that's like, I suppose that's where Volume 2 comes in and where the story gets a little bit richer, right?
Yeah, it's definitely going in that direction. It still leaves there's still a lot to come about, as we'll see. But talking about speaking to the guy who's written the book, and they talk about that safe zone, they say, I think the Pettibone says,
I know what you're about to say.
Yeah, oh, you didn't put that in your book, surprisingly. You just moved yourself into the safe zone with all your security, but you didn't put that in the book. And he goes, gotta save something for the second book. And immediately I'm like, that encapsulates.
And also, why would I make the most expensive neighborhood in New York more expensive?
Yes, exactly.
No, why would I make the only safe neighborhood in New York more expensive?
Yeah.
And it's like, oh.
But even the fact that even then he's still like, I might put in the second one. Like if I've got nothing else, then I might put it in that one.
And he's there looking for titles for the second book, which is where Death Train comes in.
I love that as well, because he says he uses Death Train on the phone, and she's like, by the way, don't call it Death Train. That's really disrespectful to the survivors. And he's got the list of names, and it was the last one. He's like, I guess it's Death Train. And
it's the last one, and it's the only one not crossed out.
Yeah. And he's like, oh, I guess I won't use that one then. But that whole thing, like that speaks to in the wider satirical sense, it speaks to like the interests of the elite. So not necessarily the government or whatever, but
also the fact that there is a booming industry of media popping up around tragedy.
And like that book is going to be very popular in the rest of the country. You don't have to deal with the actual
100%.
maniac.
Yeah, 100%. And I imagine they'll sell no copies in New York. But again, that's a thriving economy, isn't it? And again, it's the kind of wine and murder thing. It's the murder podcast thing of like, people enjoying true crime.
Yeah.
And it's that, it kind of almost, I mean, it is, I mean, that book would have been a true crime book, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And so it's sort of, it's a quite a succinct critique of an industry that exists. And I'm not going to talk shit about the true crime guys, because a lot of them make podcasts. And a lot of them make very well subscribed to ostensibly very good podcasts. It's not something I've ever listened to. But it is, on some level, an industry that piggybacks on suffering.
Yeah.
It's an industry that only exists because they're commentating on human suffering, right?
My only issue with true crime stuff is I'm all well for it when it can give everything at the end. But when it's like, here's a true crime thing, and then the end's like, and we don't know who did it, and that's the end. I'm like, I just listened to this for ages, and now nothing. Like,
do you know there's quite a succinct argument for the fact that the kind of hatred of true crime is just straight up misogyny?
I didn't know that. I'm not surprised anything comes down to misogyny, to be honest.
The genre of true crime is overwhelmingly more popular with women.
Right.
In general, just if you look at listener stats on readerships and stuff. And so they often think that actually it's just a way of men belittling women's interests. So I'm really sorry that I went for true crime, guys.
Well, at least I have a specific gripe with it, like, because there's the ones where it's like, and here's what happened, and you go, wow, that was, it raised the mystery and then it explained it. Again, this comes back to my thing with the lore of horror monsters. I'm like, yeah, but where did it come from? And
what's your favorite horror monster?
Well, I've been put on the spot here. I did like Jason Voorhees in the original Friday the 13th, maybe because he was so iconic. I guess as monsters, generally, like, in terms of a franchise, I'm really a big fan of the Evil Dead series, and they have what's called the Deadites.
Yes.
And they're great because they're kind of a mix of zombies and possession. And specifically what it is the Evil Dead series, what's great about it is it's very over-the-top tropic horror, but it's also got this splash of, like, dark comedy and slapstick in them.
Yeah.
And the Deadites, what they do is they're demons who possess people and kind of turn them to zombies, but their main goal is more to torment and torture other people around them.
Do you know much about early, I think it's Caribbean? The early Caribbean folkloric, like monster stories that zombies come from?
Very loosely. It wasn't zombies. It was in modern media. It was attributed to voodoo, which isn't the real case at all, is it?
Well, it kind of is, yeah. And voodoo has strong links to African and Afro-Caribbean cultures.
Right.
And so, yeah, that whole thing with, like, possession and witchcraft and stuff is really strongly linked with that. And you'd probably find some of it quite interesting if that's something you're into.
Well, what's interesting about Evil Dead is the reason they did what they did was because the people who made it, especially director Sam Raimi and the star Bruce Campbell, they just want to make a film.
Yeah.
Like, they were just film buffs. They were like, we could make a horror film because we know a bunch of people who can make these prosthetics, and we just make a fun, like, very tropey cabin in the woods. Like, they really nailed down that trope as, like, a thing. And then it did really successful, and they were like, I guess we'll make more. And to be fair, you can tell they care about it. But it was interesting that when they first made it, they was like, let's just make a film. Actually, same with Friday the 13th. That one was made because the person who made it, they needed funding to make a different film. So they were like, all right, let's make a by the numbers horror film.
Yeah.
And then let's just make that and then get that out, and then that'll raise money. We can make this other film.
Right. Did it work?
Well, I think they made the other film because Friday the 13th was really popular
it was incredibly successful,
to the point where no one remembers what the other film was, but everyone knows Friday the 13th.
I remember the first time I watched Friday the 13th, it shat me up because I watched it in bed on my little CRT TV,
right?
Which was like on a wall in the corner of my bedroom at like 1 o'clock in the morning on Halloween when I should have been in bed, and I had it on really quiet, and I watched it and it fucking terrified me.
Was it the last scene?
Yeah, no. I mean, the whole thing is pretty scary for a kid as well. So I really like Chupacabra. Do you know what's interesting about Chupacabra?
All I know is that it's Mexican.
Yeah. And then, like, southern states of America, because that's technically should be Mexico.
Yeah. The Chupacabra does not acknowledge international borders.
Apparently a lot of Mexicans don't either.
If you listen to right-wing pundits, yeah.
We should probably take that bit out. Nah, it's the funniest thing I've said all episode.
Nah, the joke is, if you listen to right-wing media in America, apparently there's waves of them coming over the wall like bloody... what's the zombie film? It's the one with Brad Pitt, and I can't remember... It's like
there's a zombie film with Brad Pitt.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Day of the Dead?
No, it's not Day of the Dead.
Dawn of the Dead?
No, it's way after those.
Okay.
Someone's screaming at the podcast player right now because I can't remember what it is, and I can't be asked to look it up. But in that film, there's so many zombies that they're hitting these giant walls, and they're just like building on top of each other, and like spilling over like a tsunami of zombies. And that's why I think right wing pundits in America think of Mexicans.
Yeah. So Chupacabra, what's really interesting is that that myth kind of evolved in the late 20th century.
Mm.
And we think of it as being this age-old, like old Mexican folkloric thing, but actually it's incredibly recent.
Really?
Yeah, and I found that really interesting. Like it doesn't enter the popular conscious in a really meaningful way until like the 80s or the 90s.
I think a lot of stuff like that is a lot of cultures have their own version of this.
Yes.
I think they all looked at America's Bigfoot and were like, yeah, let's make our own version. Like, we want one of those.
We're going to have an off-brand Bigfoot.
Yeah. Chupacabra is Pepsi to Bigfoot's Coca-Cola.
Prefer Pepsi, man.
Yeah, same. They've all got aspartame in.
Yeah, oh God. Yeah, let's not have that conversation again.
I'd tell towards the ending of the comic is when some of the big panel back to the comic.
Yeah, there you go.
Some of the big panels, big splash panels of, for one thing, the character Gabriella, who is
splash panels.
Yeah,
never heard it called that before.
Yeah, I've heard that term, and I probably used it incorrectly, but it's the idea of like a big splash of color and stuff on the page.
I like that, like a splash panel, because we talk about that a lot, don't we? And now I have a verbiage for it that I'm just going to steal from you.
We pick these up as we go along, like house style and letterer and things like that.
Yeah.
But
God, we've learned so much about comics from doing this.
One would argue that we probably should have known more before we started, but hey.
Well, I know, but it's been. Do you know what? When you
the audience has learned
it,
along with us.
Yeah, the real gift was the friends we made along the way.
The inside comic book and knowledge and lore that we learn along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. There's big splash panels of Gabriella.
Yeah, well, one of them was Gabriella, who I thought they did a good job of making her like a I hope she survives kind of character.
Yes.
And then it did a kind of this comic book's version of the jump scare. And it was where you kind of turn the page, even though we're digitally, but you turn the page and it's the Harry behind her and the knife has gone straight through her torso and it's all suddenly red everywhere and everything. So I thought that was good. And then also another one later was when Green sets fire to Harry, it becomes this big bright yellow and orange color. And again, because of the watercolor aspect, it kind of blends it. This is where the lines go a bit like right out the window.
Did you clock that was what was going to happen when she took the flask?
So it's hard to gauge because I don't know. I can't remember if I did it on my first read through, and obviously I knew it was going to happen on my second.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I did or not.
So 100% as soon as she took that flask, I was like, she's going to try and burn him with that whiskey.
It did a good tropic foreshadowing of he's like, what's the one thing Harry does? Like, well, fire, because one time he was on fire and he didn't like it, and that's like, well, now we know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
But then you would expect like these characters, the main characters, are meant to be. Well, at least one of them is a Harry expert, essentially.
They're meant to be at least competent.
Yeah, and the other one's been working on the case for so long, so they have this information. So naturally, they'd be like, right, let's use that as soon as possible.
Yeah, 100%. And you know what? Like, it's storytelling. That's what happens, isn't it? Like, you acquire a tool, you use it to solve a problem. Harry is a problem. Fire is a tool. I don't know that whiskey in the mouth would burn like that.
I think it depends on the whiskey. Like maybe some are more flammable than others.
I think you need over 80% proof alcohol,
right,
to burn. Most like American bourbon whiskey, at least, is like 40%.
So it's 80 proof, which is our 40%.
Yeah, you need pretty strong alcohol, basically.
Yeah, proof is double our European percentages, I think.
Yeah, it's wild, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you need really strong booze. Like the implication there is that Pettibone is basically just drinking paint thinners.
Yeah, in a very tropic PTSD cop kind of.
Because you can get like a little bit of fire to sit on top of some brandy. But if you want alcohol that burns like explosively, you need a lot of alcohol in that liquid.
Well, also it's the spray function as well, isn't it? You can't just spit a mouthful of water at a flame. It works like it's the spray aspect that makes it like it's got to be fine enough, kind of mist almost, for the fire to catch between the droplets.
You need the perfect spit take.
Yeah, true. You need from a wrestling nerd, you need a Triple H entrance spit take.
All right, okay, yeah. Any wrestling nerds, that one was for you.
Hey.
I've always wanted to do a spit take.
It's fun.
Have you done one?
I think I did. I think I was like drinking with people outside once. We were like, just when you got cheap alcohol and someone brings up and you do the right, tell me something shocking. It's like, by the way, I'm pregnant. You go,
so you've done a spit. I've never done a spit take.
Well, next time we're out, if we're less reputable venue with cheap beer, then we'll do that.
Okay.
And then someone will be like, get outside if you're going to spit everywhere. Just at the bar, spitting at each other like, why is this bad? What?
Spraying the bar down with Carling.
For those who don't know, that's one of the cheap beers.
It's a premium lager, I think.
I mean, just because it says premium on the can doesn't...
No, it's not. It's not good. Don't drink Carling.
If you heard it first, kids, drink 80 proof whiskey, but don't drink Carling.
Well, if you're going to do a flamethrower spit take, yes, get very, very strong scotch.
Oh, towards the end, I can't remember which parts for me when the last issue of this volume or the next in the volume 2. So do you remember what the last kind of issue, like what happened in that? Because I remember vaguely. I don't want to say anything.
The museum thing that we talked about.
That was the one thing, yeah. Did you see Green kind of getting like a bit of public ridicule for taking the blame?
Yeah.
So I thought that was a good thing of like putting the characters through a bit more, like, what's the word? Like,
yeah, do you know, I forgot about that.
Trial by fire kind of stuff.
And again, that really speaks to the court of public opinion that we have now.
Yes. And we behind the scenes obviously says to like, she is taking the blame for the mayor's poor decisions.
Yeah.
In response, the deal was that she stays on the task force essentially. Yeah. And you see people being like, why did you let those people die? And Green just has to be like, I thought I was doing what was best and sorry.
Yeah, God. And she handles it really well, doesn't she?
I think that speaks a lot to her character. And I think, again, it's stuff like that which made me appreciate the characters. Like, again, not in they're written really complex and, but just enough of like, God, they've been through a lot. Like, I hope they make it. Like that kind of level. And especially now, Green's going through that kind of stuff as well. But yeah, I thought it was a nice little end to the bleak ending of this volume. Yeah. And especially, again, you have that right-wing pundit again who is basically saying like they absolutely ruined this and they're making a mockery of this and I won't stand for it and we need to vote them out. And then as soon as the cameras rolls off, he's just like, right, I'm getting the fuck out of here before Harry might turn up. And then the homeless guy's like, hey, can you spare some change? He's like, get the fuck away from me.
Yeah.
And then the homeless guy gets killed and that's by Harry. And that I think was a last little, it is the working class and poor who are suffering.
Most affected.
Yeah, suffering the decisions made by the upper class.
Yeah, absolutely.
And little down on it, but I think if you have any interest in this kind of, especially in this first volume, I would implore you to keep reading because I think it does a lot of interesting stuff going forward.
Yeah.
And a bit more of the same as well. Like, it doesn't, like, completely change tone or anything. It continues what it was doing, but it's worth continuing in my opinion.
I can only give it, like, a half-hearted recommendation. Like, I enjoyed it for what it was. I don't know that if we weren't going to record and talk about it here, that I would bother with the second volume.
That's fair. And
but it wasn't bad. It just wasn't. It just didn't. It didn't really get me going like it got you going.
Would you say it wasn't for you? Like what it was trying to do?
and again, it wasn't bad. Like there are aspects of it that I really enjoyed. It's just that overall, I found it all a little bit average.
That's fair. I think my main takeaway was I enjoyed like I said before, the mixing of the genres and the satirical writing and everything. And I think this is definitely one of those, if you're into X, you'll like Y kind of things.
Yeah.
So that was our first big spooky horror of the month of October.
Yeah.
Or as we're calling it, Scary October.
It's spooky season.
Spooky season.
Spooky season. The season of spooks.
We haven't nailed down the name yet, but we're gonna just keep
it's
making
spooky season. I've told you.
The old Spooktober. Nah, that's probably taken.
Well, because I wanted to do October exclusively be Star Trek stuff and call it Spocktober.
And that is a good idea.
If somebody else from another podcast does that now, we'll have a record of like, no, Jamie thought this up.
And we are suing you for all your revenue.
Absolutely.
We'll take that in a PayPal transfer.
So thank you for listening. I hope you've had a wonderful time.
A scary time.
I hope you've had a spooky time. As Ryan has mentioned, this is the first in our spooky season for October. So if you'd like more horror-related content, please do come back next week. You want to tell us why Jamie's wrong, you can go to comicliterate@gmail.com. Watch the shorts on YouTube, watch the shorts on TikTok, listen to the podcast, do the things, leave a review.
And especially if you have any recommendations for scary comics.
Because we're fucking shit out.
Well, I've found some, but they are few and further in between.
So if there's any particular spooky comics you want to hear us talk about, comicliterate@gmail.com. Thank you so much.
I'll tell you, the biggest issue is with spooky comics or any kind of like smaller genre of comics. It's
I'm trying to take us out.
I know. But I'm just saying, they are there, but it's knowing which ones are good before we get into them.
Absolutely.
And as we've established, this is not quite your wheelhouse, so I don't want to present you with a bad one.
Like a month's worth of it.
Exactly. Although we are doing one particularly bad one. But that's going to add to the horror, so that'll be fun.
Thank you and good night. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. Every week for the rest of the